Do you ever struggle with your prayer life, wondering what to pray or how to truly connect with God day to day? Introducing the Grace Daily Devotions app, your journey to deeper faith and personalized spiritual growth. Grace delivers daily devotions and prayers crafted just for you, based on what your heart and soul needs most. Experience devotional time and prayer like never before. Daily devotions made easy. No more searching, no more guessing, just grace, guidance, and growth at your fingertips using the latest technology. Download the Grace Daily Devotions app by going to graceapp.io. That's graceapp.io. Let grace inspire your prayer life. Start your journey now.
Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey.
Here be not many of the Church of England, few Roman Catholics, abundance of Quakers, preachers, men and women especially, singing Quakers, ranting Quakers, Sabbatarians, anti-Sabbatarians, some Anabaptists, some Independents, some Jews, in short, of all sorts of opinions, religious denominations. There are some, and the most part of none at all. Thomas Dongan, 2nd Earl of Limerick, commenting on the religious state of New York City during his time as governor from 1683 to 1688.
Previously, we explored the deep and surprising roots of the Catholic Church in the Americas, long before the United States was even an idea. From Norse settlements to Spanish explorers, we saw how the church was present in North America for centuries before 1776. Now we turn our attention to the English. In this part, we'll look at how English colonies took shape along the Atlantic coast, how religion played into their development, and how all of this helped shape the ground the Catholic Church would eventually grow on in what would become the United States. So let's just get right to it. We're going to start right in the thick of it. Summer of 1776. The American Revolution is in full spring. The colonies were in open rebellion against the British Crown. But before we go too deep into the military side of things, we need to take a step back and get a high-level view of what these British colonies actually looked like, especially when it came to religion and demographics. At that time, the total population of the 13 colonies was around 2.5 million people. To give some perspective, the population of Britain itself was around 8 million. Each colony had its own particular character shaped by who founded it, when it was founded, and why the colony was founded. Let's start right in the center, Virginia. It was the most populous colony and the first to be permanently established. It was officially Anglican, and Anglicanism was the state religion. The same went for North and South Carolina. These colonies had established churches tied to the government, and they reflected the religious structure of England. Georgia was a bit looser in terms of religious control. There was more sectarian diversity and some degree of freedom of conscience, except for Catholicism, of course. That was still largely illegal. Now, technically, not one of the 13 colonies, but worth noting, was Florida, then known as East and West Florida. They were two separate colonies. Florida had been a Spanish colony, but it passed into British hands about a decade before the Revolution during the French and Indians War. It was still a largely Catholic place, but British influence was growing. That changed again in 1783 when Florida was returned to Spain as a part of the Treaty of Paris. Interestingly, the governor of New Spain at the time, Bernardo de Galvez, played a major role in the American victory by launching military actions against British Florida. His campaigns helped pull British forces away from the southern colonies, easing pressure on the American cause. Let's swing north of Virginia to Maryland. Maryland was founded as a Catholic colony by the Calvert family, though it also included largely Protestant settlers. Catholics would have been maybe about 25% of the population, which was huge compared to other colonies. But I mean, in the big scheme of things, it was still only about a quarter. It was relatively tolerant compared to other colonies. We'll dive much more into the story of Maryland soon for obvious reasons. It was Catholic. Pennsylvania, founded by the Quakers under William Penn, was also a place of religious tolerance, at least by the standards of its time. It had a mix of Protestants, Catholics, and even Jews. There were some tensions, to be sure, but it was generally more peaceful on the religious front than most of the other colonies. New York, New Jersey, and Delaware originally were Dutch settlements, and their Reformed Dutch heritage brought a surprisingly strong spirit of religious toleration. In theory, everyone was welcome. In practice, many people just didn't pay attention to religion at all. As the saying goes, New York was already becoming the melting pot it's known as today. Commerce and not necessarily creed was the main priority. The Dutch were also very different in the way that they organized their colonies over the British, much more so with large settlements, with land around, with a village and a town, just a different feel. And you can even see that today in parts of eastern New York, where that you get a more of a Dutch feeling, I guess you would say, if you knew that in hindsight, but there's a different feel in that area because of the Dutch influence. So then we get up to the New Englanders, the New England colonies, where things looked very different. Everything goes with what I'm going to say now, except for the colony of Rhode Island, which was a haven of religious toleration. As far as the other colonies of New England went, though, they were deeply rooted in a very strict form of Calvinist Protestantism called Puritan Congregationalism. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire built their societies along these religious ideals. Church services were long and serious. Laws were detailed and extensive. If you stepped out of line, even during church services, you could be publicly, and probably were going to be publicly, punished. This was the environment of the infamous witchcraft trials. And here's an interesting contrast. While Protestant colonies like those in New England went wild over witchcraft, Catholic countries often didn't. The Inquisition, for all its faults, was more concerned with heresy and doctrinal errors than witchcraft per se. Catholics thought, going back to Constantine, tended to separate the roles of church and state. Not total separation, of course. That would be absurd. But the religion had certain spheres, and the government, secular government, or the princes, emperors, had certain spheres of influence. The notable exception, the Papal States, where the Pope was both the religious and the secular ruler. But even with that, I have a hard time saying Rome was a theocracy under the papacy, just because there was this real idea of that the way things worked with the religion was in some way distinct from the state. I'd love to hear what you think about that, and we can definitely discuss that. But back to New England. This intense religiosity meant Catholics were viewed with deep, deep suspicion, if not outright hostility. Their religion was illegal. Other versions of Christianity were frowned upon as well, but Catholicism in particular was seen as extremely dangerous. To the north of New England was British Canada, Upper and Lower Canada, and the Atlantic colonies. Quebec was the heart of what was once called New France. New France had been under British rule since the end of the French and Indian War about a decade earlier. It was still overwhelmingly Catholic. The French had explored deep into the interior, down the Mississippi and beyond, and had relatively strong relationships with many of the Native American tribes. Catholic missionaries were active and often very effective. French explorers commonly married into native communities, far more than their English counterparts, which really didn't at all. With rebellion brewing in the 13 colonies, the British Crown made a surprising move. They reached out to the French Canadians. Initially, kind of like in Florida, the British tried to assimilate the locals, Anglicize them, if you will, but that wasn't working. So instead, the Crown passed something called the Quebec Act of 1775. It gave Catholics in Quebec the right to practice their faith, collect tithes, hold public office, and maintain many of their local institutions. It also granted Quebec a massive swath of land stretching all the way to the southern tip of Illinois, which they probably pronounced as Illinois. But anyways, to many English colonists, this was shocking, outrageous even. It became one of the so-called intolerable acts. Why? Because it confirmed everything many Protestants feared about the Catholics, that they couldn't be trusted, that they would be granted special privileges, and that the Catholic Church would take over everything. The Pope is the king. And yet, despite all their suspicion, the American colonies still tried to convince the Quebecois to join their rebellion. Unsurprisingly, Quebec wasn't interested. They'd been given nearly everything they could possibly want. So what did the Americans do? They invaded Quebec. Yes. In 1775, American forces launched an invasion of Quebec. It included some of the biggest names of the war, like Benedict Arnold when he was still a good guy. As a quick aside, I think Benedict Arnold is one of the most fascinating characters in all of history. He is someone who could have been at the very top of the American pantheon of heroes, maybe even at the George Washington level. That's what he wanted, was this notoriety and this wealth, but his personality got in the way, and through a series of really short-sighted decisions, he will remain remembered forever, but not remembered fondly at all as the biggest traitor in American history, the Brutus of American history. If Dante was around in the 1700s, I guarantee he would have placed Benedict Arnold in the lowest level of the Inferno. But that's getting back to Catholic history there, deep history. But back to Quebec. The hope was that the population would rise up and join the Americans. Spoiler alert, the Quebecois didn't. The Americans had some early victories, but the campaign stalled and then collapsed. The American army retreated back to New York and New England. Many soldiers died or were captured, and to make matters worse, things weren't going well for the Americans anywhere else on the field as well. One last area worth touching on before we moved over were basically what we might call the other British colonies. These include places like Nova Scotia and the British West Indies in the Caribbean. There were diplomatic efforts to get some of these regions to join the rebellion, but for the most part, they didn't. The populations were small, tightly connected to Britain economically, and generally not interested in revolution. In places like Nova Scotia, where the British military presence was strong, rebellion just wasn't on the table. Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month. But it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/History of the Papacy and join today.
Do you ever struggle with your prayer life, wondering what to pray or how to truly connect with God day to day? Introducing the Grace Daily Devotions app, your journey to deeper faith and personalized spiritual growth. Grace delivers daily devotions and prayers crafted just for you, based on what your heart and soul needs most. Experience devotional time and prayer like never before. Daily devotions made easy. No more searching, no more guessing, just grace, guidance, and growth at your fingertips using the latest technology. Download the Grace Daily Devotions app by going to graceapp.io. That's graceapp.io. Let grace inspire your prayer life. Start your journey now.
In this next section, we'll dive into one of the biggest underlying themes of this whole story, why so many English colonists distrusted, disliked, and even feared the Catholic Church. This context is absolutely key to understanding the Church's early experience in the United States. To really understand why Catholics were so widely distrusted in early English America, we have to take a quick ride through the Reformation. Don't worry, I'll keep this one tight. We'll definitely go deeper in future series, but for now, we just need the essentials. So let's rewind to 1585. That's when the first English colony in North America was founded, Roanoke Island. It didn't last, but it marks the beginning of the English colonial ambitions in the area that would become the United States. Fast forward less than 200 years, and that tiny idea grew into full-blown revolution and founding of a new country. But just 50 years before Roanoke, England was arguably the most Catholic country in Europe. That might sound strange now, but it's true. King Henry VIII was such a staunch supporter of the Catholic Church that Pope Leo X gave him the title Defender of the Faith in 1521. Meanwhile, things were starting to get shaky in Northern Europe. Italy wasn't a country yet, neither was Germany. The Holy Roman Empire, mostly modern-day Germany and some surrounding areas, was already full of tension and reform movements bubbling under the surface. France was Catholic, but proudly independent of the Pope. Spain and Portugal were solid Catholic strongholds. And then came Martin Luther. Dun, dun, dun. In 1517, just 4 years before Henry VIII got his fancy title, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther posted a document that would ignite a fire. At first, he wasn't trying to break away from the church. He wanted to fix it. But his proposed reforms were radical, and by the 1530s, what started as a lowercase reform turned into the uppercase hashtag Reformation. The Holy Roman Empire split into factions. New groups and sects emerged. Quakers, Baptists, Anabaptists, Mennonites, Calvinists, Lutherans, you name it. So where does Henry VIII, King of England, the defender of the faith, fit into all of this? Well, he desperately needed a male heir. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the famously Catholic monarchs and also defenders of the faith, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, wasn't able to provide Henry his heir. They had a daughter, Mary, but Henry wanted a son desperately. He asked the Pope for an annulment. Technically, divorce wasn't allowed in the Catholic Church, but with the right paperwork, enough legal gymnastics, something called an annulment could be granted. It was kind of like a do-over. It's saying that marriage just didn't officially happen. The sacrament itself wasn't valid, and there's many reasons that an annulment can be granted. And Henry had a decent case for an annulment, but that's beyond the scope of this episode. But Pope Clement VII was stuck between two powerful Catholic rulers, Henry of England and the very Catholic, very powerful Spain. He stalled, so Henry took matters into his own hands. In 1533, Henry declared his marriage to Catherine null and void and married Anne Boleyn. He also declared himself the head of the church in England. Just like that, the Anglican Church was born. And we see a very different, something really new comes out of this, that the head of the government is also the head of the church. And that's something that just really wasn't seen in Catholic and Orthodox Christianity before that, maybe in very limited slices, but nothing to this degree and nothing under this kind of control. Now, at first, it didn't look much different from the Catholic Church, this new English church. Same structure, same liturgy. But with every monarch after Henry, things shifted, sometimes more Catholic, but eventually more Reformation heavy. Over time, England developed this push and pull between a high church and a low church. High church meant more traditional, more Catholic looking, smells, bells, incense, vestments. Low church meant stripped down worship, minimal ceremony, radically different theology in many cases, and more focused around a sermon. Other groups like the Puritan and the Congregationalists began to form or break away. Each new wave pushed English Christianity further from Rome. Under Queen Elizabeth I, England tried to strike a balance between the factions, but she was really no friend to the Catholics. She passed harsh laws banning Catholic worship, clergy, and sacraments. Catholicism became not just unpopular, it became straight up treasonous. Things escalated with the gunpowder plot of 1605, where a group of Catholics supposedly tried to blow up Parliament and kill the king. Whether it was a genuine conspiracy of Catholics or what we might today call a false flag operation, the outcome was absolutely clear. Anti-Catholic sentiment exploded. This gunpowder plot gave rise to Guy Fawkes Night, also known in the American colonies as Pope Day, a yearly anti-Catholic celebration that continued well into the Revolutionary period. And all of this spilled over into the colonies. The dominant Protestant groups in America, especially the Puritan and Congregationalists of New England, viewed Catholicism with suspiciousness and outright hatred. Their Calvinist theology directly clashed with Catholic teachings on everything from church authority to Mary to saints to salvation itself. But it wasn't just theological. Politics played a major role as well. England was frequently at war with Catholic powers like France and Spain, especially in North America. These were not just rival nations, they were revival religions. All of this fed into laws passed in the colonies that banned Catholic worship, outlawed Catholic clergy, barred Catholics from holding office, and denied them the ability to do the sacraments. In some places, even being openly Catholic was enough to get you in trouble, big trouble. So by the time of the American Revolution was heating up, English colonists weren't just fighting a political war. They were living in a religious culture that had spent generations painting the Catholic Church as the enemy. And yet, as we'll see, Catholics were still there. They still found ways to worship, to build communities, and take part in the American story, even when the door was just barely open. Now that we've covered the upheaval of the Reformation and how it shaped English attitudes towards the Catholic Church, let's flip that coin and look at how the Catholic Church responded, because make no mistake, the Church did respond. And that response had direct consequences for how Catholicism developed in the Americas. The Catholic Church's response is known as the Counter-Reformation. This was more than just a reaction. It was a wide-reaching reform movement in its own right. And one of its most significant outcomes was the creation of a new kind of religious order, the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. The Jesuits were founded by Ignatius Loyola, a former soldier who, along with a small group of companions, envisioned a different kind of monastic order. They were organized along military lines, disciplined, obedient, and mission-driven. They answered directly to the Pope, not to local bishops, and they didn't just stay cloistered in their monasteries. They went out into the world. Jesuits became zealous missionaries, educators, and scholars. They traveled across the globe, including deep into the Americas, and made a huge mark on Catholic education. Even when the order was suppressed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, their impact did not fade, and their organizational spirit lived on. In fact, one of the most important Catholic leaders in the American colonies, John Carroll, was trained as a Jesuit. He brought that same sense of structure and dedication to his work in British North America and later on in the early United States. Jesuits were also vital in New France. You'll see their fingerprints all over early missionary work, settlement, and development. The Catholic Native American relationships as well. If there was a frontier, there was likely a Jesuit somewhere nearby. The Reformation may have knocked the Catholic Church back on its heels in Europe, but the Church rebounded fast. The age of exploration and of colonization led by Spain, Portugal, and France turned Catholicism into a global force. From Latin America to Africa to Asia, and yes, even into North America, the Catholic Church expanded like never before. Now, just a quick word on something that's going to keep coming up, and that's monastic communities. We're familiar with the standard church hierarchy, priests, bishops, cardinals, pope, etc. But monastic communities in the West operated a little differently. They had their own chain of command. These orders date way back, like the 300 AD, back to the Desert Fathers of Egypt and Eastern monastic movements. These monks lived separately from the world, practiced asceticism, and founded communities built around prayer, study, and work. Over the centuries, all kinds of monastic orders developed: the Benedictines, the Augustinians, the Franciscans, and eventually the Jesuits. Some were more traditional, others more radical, but they shared a common thread: living a communal life with a spiritual purpose. Monastic orders included both lay and clerical members, and they didn't always fall neatly under local church hierarchy. An individual monk or priest in a monastic order usually answered to an abbot, and then up the line to a superior within that order, and ultimately the Pope. But the local bishop didn't necessarily have much of a say in the way the monastic order worked. That setup could and often did cause big tension. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Do you ever struggle with your prayer life, wondering what to pray or how to truly connect with God day to day? Introducing the Grace Daily Devotions app, your journey to deeper faith and personalized spiritual growth. Grace delivers daily devotions and prayers crafted just for you, based on what your heart and soul needs most. Experience devotional time and prayer like never before, Daily devotions made easy. No more searching, no more guessing, just grace, guidance, and growth at your fingertips using the latest technology. Download the Grace Daily Devotions app by going to graceapp.io. That's graceapp.io. Let grace inspire your prayer life. Start your journey now.
In places like the British colonies where there was no Catholic bishop for a long time, the situation got even messier. Without a clear hierarchy, different priests and orders had to figure things out on their own. There was no central authority to coordinate or mediate disputes. And even when the idea of appointing a bishop came up, many Catholics hesitated. They worried that having a formal Catholic structure might provoke a backlash from their Protestant neighbors, or even worse, from colonial governments. Eventually, a bishop would be chosen and consecrated, but that moment didn't come easily, and we'll explore how that happened in the next part. The point is here, Catholic life in the American colonies wasn't just about Catholics versus non-Catholics. There were internal conflicts, too, between monastic orders and secular clergy, between differing visions of how the church should function in a Protestant majority milieu, and between old structures imported from Europe and new realities on the American frontier. Conflict in one form or another is going to be a reoccurring theme inside the church, outside of it, and in all the places those boundaries blur. Next, we'll dig into what the Catholic Church actually looked like on the ground in British America and how it all led to the appointment of the very first American bishop. So let's zoom in on one of the most important chapters in early American Catholic history, the founding of a Catholic refuge, the colony of Maryland. Maryland was established in 1634 and was something of an experiment, a place where English Catholics might finally find some breathing room. The first Catholic Mass in the colony was celebrated that same year on the banks of the Potomac River at St. Mary's by Reverend Andrew White, a Jesuit. The colony was chartered to Cecil Calvert, 2nd Lord Baltimore, a Catholic nobleman. He never actually traveled to Maryland himself, though. The day-to-day operations were handled by his brother and later his son, Charles Calvert, 3rd Baron of Baltimore, or Lord of Baltimore. The Calverts served as the Lord Proprietors, essentially the rulers of the colony, and remained major landholders all the way up to the American Revolution. Early on, Maryland really did offer Catholics a haven, at least in comparison to neighboring colonies like Virginia, where Catholics weren't exactly welcomed, either religiously or economically. By the 1640s, there were about 100 Catholics living in Maryland. That might not sound like much, but for a long time, that would be the highest concentration of Catholics in any of the 13 colonies. The Jesuits quickly became the most important religious order in the region. They owned large tracts of land, operated missions, and like many other colonial elites, owned enslaved people and indentured servants. By 1765, the Jesuits in Maryland owned at least 192 slaves. Even though they were the dominant Catholic presence, the Jesuits couldn't legally build a proper church. Anti-Catholic laws still loomed in the background, and tensions didn't just stay in the background for long. One little-known but fascinating event, the Battle of the Severn in 1655, took place in Maryland. It was actually the final battle of the English Civil War, not fought in England, but fought in Maryland. Catholic and Protestant royalists fought with Puritan settlers. So yes, even halfway around the world, these religious and political conflicts followed the colonists. In 1689, things took a sharp turn for Maryland Catholics. They were stripped of all of their civil rights. From that point on, Catholics could only worship in private homes. They maintained wealth in many cases, but they were barred from holding public office or participating in public life religiously. They weren't allowed to openly practice their religion. And this wasn't unique to Maryland. New York's anti-Catholic laws weren't repealed until 1784. The first proper Catholic church in Maryland wouldn't be built until the 1760s in Baltimore. By the time of the American Revolution in 1776, there were fewer than 20,000 Catholics in all of the 13 colonies, and most of them lived in Maryland and Pennsylvania. But as the revolution progressed and the U.S. gained new territory, especially in the West, it absorbed large populations of French Catholics, another key part of our story going forward. In 1786, a kind of semi-official Catholic census was taken by John Carroll, who we'll talk about more in the next section. Carroll noted that many of the Catholics in the U.S. were what we might call Christmas and Easter Catholics. They didn't engage much with their faith beyond the occasional holiday. Part of that was likely practical. There were very few priests, and most of them were Jesuits, and that order had been suppressed by Rome in 1773 and wouldn't be fully restored until the early 1800s. The priests who were active had to ride the circuit. They travel from town to town, perform mass, hear confessions, offer sacraments, and then ride right out. They couldn't even perform confirmation because there was no bishop in British North America. Meanwhile, anti-Catholic sentiment was still strong. John Jay, future Supreme Court Chief Justice, wanted to deny Catholic citizenship. And future President John Adams wasn't exactly subtle in his views. He once said that papists were as rare as comets and earthquakes in his hometown of Braintree, Massachusetts, near Boston. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, everyone. Super Bowl champ Vernon Davis here from Legal Help Center. If you've been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, listen up, because we have legal professionals standing by right now to answer your questions for free. You can find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, Vernon. You heard it, folks. If you've been injured, call and find out how much you qualify for. Call 800-497-4410. Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center. May not be available in all states.
Despite all of that, Catholics still showed up for the American Revolution. Maryland Catholics were overwhelmingly pro-patriot. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, a relative of John Carroll, was the only Catholic signatory of the Declaration of Independence. Two more Catholics signed the U.S. Constitution, Daniel Carroll, John Carroll's brother, and Thomas Fitzsimmons of Pennsylvania. The major group of Catholics that sided with the British Crown were a group of Scots-Irish Catholics who settled in central New York. So while the church still faced hostility and discrimination, Catholic Americans were already helping shape the foundation of the new nation. Next, let's turn our attention to the man who helped bring some structure and vision to American Catholicism, John Carroll, and explain how the church in the early United States began to organize itself for the long road ahead. Let's talk about one of the most important figures in that entire history of the Catholic Church in America, period, up to this day, and that's John Carroll. I would say he ranks right up there with Pope Leo XIV, formerly Chicago's Robert Prevost, the first American-born pope. But Carroll was the one who laid the groundwork. He helped shape the Catholic Church in a new nation and in a religious landscape unlike anything the Catholic Church had faced before. The Carroll family were major Catholic landowners and aristocrats in Maryland, wealthy, well-connected, and deeply tied to the life of the colony. But it's John Carroll, Jesuit priest and future bishop, who really stands out above them all. He was born on January 8th of 1735 and lived until December 3rd, 1815. Carroll had a remarkably long life for his time period, and during that life, he helped build from the ground up a church in what was officially considered a missionary district by Rome. And this would be considered, the United States would be considered a missionary jurisdiction up until 1908. Carroll himself was educated at Saint Omer, a Jesuit seminary in what is now Belgium, where he entered the Jesuit order. He was in Rome in 1773 when Pope Clement XIV formally suppressed the Jesuit order, and that experience really left a bad taste in Carroll's mouth, particularly with the whole bureaucracy of the Papal States and the Vatican, including the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of Faith, often simply called the Propaganda. That same institution, by the way, is known as today the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, currently led by Cardinal Luis Tagle, who was considered a major contender for the 2025 conclave that did elect American Pope Leo XIV. Carroll returned to Maryland in 1774, just as tensions with Britain were escalating. He personally was a bit lukewarm about revolution at first, but as we've noted, many Catholics in Maryland, including the broader Carroll family, were firmly on the Patriots' side, with a few exceptions. Early in the war, Carroll was sent on a diplomatic mission as part of the Quebec expedition, a military campaign aimed at convincing French Catholics in Quebec to support the American Revolution. Carroll's job was to win hearts and minds. The mission, it was a total disaster. The Quebecois had recently been granted major protections and privileges by the British under the Quebec Act and had very little interest in rebellion. The Americans had hoped the people would rise up to join them, but they didn't. The campaign fell apart and many American soldiers either died or had to retreat. Still, some historians argue that this failed invasion set the stage for other key battles that eventually turned the tide of the war. Interestingly, Carroll's participation in that mission may have helped soften attitudes towards Catholics among some Patriot leaders, especially in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. But the real issue facing American Catholics at the time wasn't diplomacy, it was structure. There was no bishop, there was no diocese, there was no real hierarchy at all in America. And this wasn't just a problem for Catholics. Even American Anglicans didn't have a bishop in America until 1784. And let's be honest, Rome didn't have a clear plan either. The Pope and his Curia weren't sure what to do with the American church, and to be honest, they didn't seem particularly interested either. American Catholics, for their part, wanted no part in being under control of an English Catholic bishop back in Britain. That was just a non-starter. There was a bishop in Quebec, but again, for obvious reasons, American Catholics didn't want to be under jurisdiction of a French bishop who wasn't American either. That bishop, but really of the Bishop of Quebec, already had more than enough on his plate, overseeing not just Quebec, but also vast swaths of French-speaking territory stretching all the way to the Mississippi River. Rome, in an attempt to solve the problem, suggested letting the Continental Congress select a bishop, a practice not unheard of in Europe. The Continental Congress gave a hard pass on that. They didn't want to get involved in church politics at all. In the meantime, Carroll was appointed superior of the Catholic clergy in America, and then later superior of the mission in the 13 colonies. This gave him some authority, but also stirred up new conflicts. Some priests had grown very comfortable, maybe too comfortable, in this leaderless system and didn't appreciate Carroll's attempts to impose some sort of canonical order. There was also ethnic tensions. Irish, French, German Catholics all had different expectations and weren't necessarily thrilled to be led by an English American Jesuit. Despite these challenges, Carroll pressed on. He had a vision, a national bishop who would oversee the church in the United States as a whole. This idea of a more or less self-governing church reflected a broader trend at the time. In places like France, this was known as Gallicanism, the belief that local churches should have a degree of independence from Rome. Carroll's vision stood in contrast to what would become the dominant theological current in Rome, Ultramontanism, the centralizing impulse that would take control in the 19th century and be solidified and locked in at the First Vatican Council under Pope Pius IX. Eventually, Rome did make a decision. The Vatican allowed American Catholics to establish their own diocese, to choose its own location as well. They chose Baltimore. They were also allowed to elect their own bishop, a major concession. In 1789, American priests voted 24-2 to elect John Carroll as the first bishop of Baltimore. He was consecrated the following year on August 5th, 1790, by an English Catholic bishop. Perhaps a bit ironic, given all the earlier hesitation around these English ties. After that, things got moving much more quickly. Carroll declined an offer from Congress to provide tax funding to the church, a principled stand in favor of religious independence and separation of church and state. In 1790, an American seminary was founded. By 1791, Georgetown Academy, which would eventually evolve into Georgetown University, was set up and running in Washington, D.C. It was the first Catholic college in the United States, and a Jesuit one at that. In many ways, the church in the United States had begun to find its footing, but that does not mean the road ahead would be smooth. And that's where we're going to leave things for now. We're definitely not done with Bishop John Carroll. In fact, we're just getting started, or at least in the middle of the starting. With Carroll's election and consecration, the American Catholic Church was finally beginning to take shape. It had a structure, it had a leadership, and it had a vision, but that didn't mean that the road ahead was going to be easy or smooth. The American project itself, the bold new experiment in democracy and republicanism, was expanding fast. Like a tech startup with a rocket strapped to its back, the United States was growing in territory, population, and ambition, and the Catholic Church in the United States had to grow and adapt right alongside it. There were massive challenges looming on the horizon. Territorial expansion would bring the church into regions that already had deep Catholic roots, especially in the former French and Spanish territories of the West and the South. How would these different traditions mesh with the growing American hierarchy? At the same time, waves of Catholic immigrants, Irish, German, later Italian, and Eastern Europeans would all flood into the country, bringing energy, numbers, and tensions with them. Then there was the enormous issue of slavery and the treatment of Native Americans, and how the church positioned itself or failed to in these moral and cultural battles will be topics we certainly will discuss. And we can't forget the ongoing distrust of Catholics by Protestant nativists who saw Catholicism as un-American and dangerous. All the while that Protestantism in America was going through rapid changes itself, which would really have waves that would affect us to this very day in the United States. Add to all of that the pressure of industrial revolution, urbanization, changing social patterns, and you've got a church that had to navigate a shifting, often hostile landscape while trying to maintain true to its faith and to its mission. As we progress, we'll look closely at all of these conflicts and complexities: territorial expansion, immigration, race, class, religion, and identity, and how the Catholic Church in America tried to hold itself together in the middle of all of that.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.